Hello, everyone. I'm Matthew Taylor. I'm the Chief Executive of the NHS Confederation. And some of you might remember that I used to be the Chief Executive of the RSA. So it's an enormous pleasure to pop back up on the RSA stage for what I'm told is the final RSA event of 2021. Do follow RSA events on Twitter, by the way, and join the mailing list to be notified for the exciting new 2022 event series that's just about to be announced. So thank you for joining us today. We're going to be reflecting on, well, it's been a truly extraordinary year, and that was before Max Verstappen beat Lewis Hamilton. So please jump on Twitter and get involved in the conversation using the hashtag RSA2021, or just get stuck in on our YouTube chat. Now, we've got a fantastic panel of commentators and journalists who've taken the time to speak with us today. What a panel it is. We're joined by a crack team of journalists. My old friend Ian Leslie, Hardeep Masaru, and Rosamund Irwin. I'll introduce them individually in a little bit, but a very big welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining us. So, well, I think it's a bit of an understatement, isn't it, to say that 2021 has provided us with a lot of material. Everything from mass global vaccination programs and COP26 to space tourism and allegedly illegal parties at number 10. But what were the major news events that shaped the year, and what can we learn from 2021, apart from the fact that prediction seems useless? Are we any further forward on global emergencies like climate change and inequality? Or has COVID seen our goals become more distant and our problems more entrenched? Perhaps even the most important events of the year, well, there's still 17 days to go. Perhaps the most important events are yet to come. Omicron, the PM under pressure, tanks massing on the borders of the Ukraine. Wow, what a lot to talk about. So first, we're going to hear from Ros Irwin. Ros is media editor of the Sunday Times. She was previously the Brexit correspondent for the paper and has broken stories, including the Yellowhammer leak of papers about a no-deal Brexit and the Martin Bashir scandal at the BBC. She was the London Evening Standard senior feature editor for many years and has published and broadcast for an enormous range of major news organisations. So, Ros, thank you for joining us today. What, for you, were the highs or lows of 2021?
I'm afraid mine that I've selected are all really lows. It's not a very cheery list. So the first story that I thought is one of the most important stories of this year is the English Channel disaster. Obviously a tragic loss of life, incredibly devastating for the people's families, but also something that tells us quite a lot about broader political themes. So the challenge of immigration and actually, obviously, Brexit comes in here too, because the relations between France and the UK are part of the course of this, and the sort of devastating human loss gets very rapidly and rather, unedifyingly overtaken by this sort of spat between the French and the English. So that would be my first one that hopefully we will talk about more broadly, because obviously immigration is going to be one of the challenges, and not just related to people. There will obviously be climate change pressures there in the future. So that was my first depressing story. Less depressing, I think, the vaccine rollout, but this is a very UK focused list. I'm sure we'll talk about issues more broadly. But I think one of the things that we're seeing now is the result with this new variant, the Omicron variant. We're seeing the result of that vaccine inequality, and people who know much more about these things than I do. I'm not obviously a scientist or a doctor, but there's been a lot of talk that part of the reason that we are susceptible to new variants is this inequality in terms of the vaccine rollout. And, obviously the richest countries have rather dominated and in fact to a sort of quite shocking level the delivery of vaccine rollout. And this was true in the summer, that I think less than 2% of of the population of the African continent had even just a first dose. And actually that number hasn't moved as much as you might hope. all these months later. And the third depressing story, that I thought from a UK point of view was the murder of Sarah Everard and the sort of conversation that resulted in and the focus on male violence against women. Now, obviously, unfortunately, women are murdered all over the world and in the UK, with alarming regularity. And this was a particular kind of murder that's actually more rare. It was a stranger murdering someone. But for that reason, and because Sarah Everard appeared, I think, to be doing a lot of sort of the so-called right things, she was going along a main road. The man involved, Wayne Couzens, was a police officer. I think this story really sort of got coverage in a way that ordinarily these things, unfortunately and wrongly, are treated as sort of just what happens. And this one led to a much broader conversation around the issues of safety, but particularly around male violence and what we can do to stop them. But what I'd say unites both the English Channel disaster and that story in terms of the media is the sad thing is quite how quickly we move on. And as a media editor, with my media editor hat on, the thing that I find very a little bit depressing is we need to have a broader conversation about finding solutions rather than what sort of happens is we focus very quickly on an issue and then, there's something else the next day or the next week. So what I would be hoping for is that we can sort of have a broader conversation around solutions to some of those issues.
Well, thanks, Ros. I feel wearing a elf top is particularly inappropriate given the list that you've shared with us. I think there is a theme, though, isn't there, Ros? And that's all these cases. There's a question about our trust in authority. So for many people, the failure of the French and the British authorities to deal with the migrant crisis, and that's from some people who think to deal with it in a humane way, and for others to deal with it in a kind of law and order kind of sense, then vaccines is a rare example. And obviously Boris Johnson is right now trying to kind of emphasize that that's a success story for the government. The government has shown its kind of competence when it comes to vaccines on the whole. And then the Sarah Everard story is part of a number of stories that have been highly problematic for the Met, another kind of source of authority. So I guess spinning them together, Ros, and we speak with, government assailed on all sides at the moment. What do you think COVID has done for our sense of authority? Has it made us even less trusting of those in power? At the beginning of COVID, it looked like it was the reverse. Most governments in power became more popular, didn't they, in the early months of COVID? We kind of leaned on those in authority. But have we just gone back to our usual surly ways, or has it even got worse?
I think you're absolutely right. And one of the things that's really interesting to me is, despite all the opposition to the lockdown measures all along, the polling on it has been really, really strongly in favour of them. In favour of tougher lockdowns. There was one poll that said that people would be very happy if nightclubs never ever reopen. There was a chunk of the population, and it was something like 1 in 5 people. I can't quite remember the exact numbers, but after COVID, because they were a transmission risk. I mean, sort of the ultimate killjoy thing. You may not want ever to go to a nightclub ever again, of course, but the idea that other people shouldn't be allowed to. So I think what's interesting to me is right at the beginning, absolutely. And actually the measures, even now when, there's a lot of obviously backbench and conservative opposition to further lockdown measures of any kind, working from home and so on. That we're all clearly having to do now. But actually, I think the problem, particularly in the UK, is this element of hypocrisy. So, I mean, it strikes me. So a year ago, I was in hospital giving birth to my son, and my husband obviously the hours he was allowed to be there were incredibly restricted. because it was a sort of safety mechanism, right? And it was to stop transmission. And at the same time, a year ago, various members of the Conservative Party allegedly were attending parties in Number 10 and other departments. And so I think that's what's chipped away at authority, is this problem that it looks so much like, and of course my problem is small compared with people who've lost relatives that they couldn't visit or any of those things, but it feels like a lot of us have sacrificed so much, and it only bonds you together if everyone else is doing it, right? If it turns out, oh wait, the government was all along not doing the things that it was imposing upon us, then of course their authority is destroyed. Nothing sort of chips away at that more than the stench of hypocrisy. And I think we've had that sort of repeatedly now. The interesting point about the vaccine rollout, I would say, isn't that really a success for the NHS? And one thing that the NHS could actually do incredibly well, because of the nature of the NHS and the way it's structured, made a vaccine rollout program actually quite easy compared with countries that don't have that. I'm not saying it was easier. Obviously, it was an incredible achievement still, but comparatively easier in countries that don't have that structure. And also that while you've talked about political authority being chipped away, do we not think the authority of the NHS in this country remains a sort of weird form of soft power, right? Who did we clap for in the beginning? NHS workers, and obviously deservedly. But I think there is a thing where and actually this comes back to polling again, when you poll people on who they trust, doctors, unsurprisingly, come up really, really high. And so I think there is a sort of success thing there that isn't really that much about government. It's a bit about government, but there are other things in place that made that, slightly better, made the UK able at the start, at least, to be a leader. Of course, we quickly got overtaken by other countries, actually.
Well, Ros, great. And how wonderful for you to end up on such a positive note about the NHS. So Ros has raised issues here around kind of social compliance, around authority, and we have no better person to speak on such issues of kind of psychology and collective action than Ian Leslie. My old friend Ian is a journalist and author of many best-selling books on human behaviour, including his latest book, Conflict, which has been lauded by everyone from Harlan Coben to Malcolm Gladwell. It featured on the RSA's Bridges to the Future podcast earlier this year. I can strongly recommend it. Ian writes about psychology, culture, technology, and business, The New Statesman, The Economist, The Guardian, The Financial Times. And a while ago, he and I even co-hosted a podcast together. So Ian, welcome. What are the key lessons of 2021 that you're going to share with us?
Okay, so one of the key events, I'm not sure what the lessons are, but we can discuss this, to my mind, was the botched attempt at a Super League by the European football authorities, which after the Euros. We can actually talk about the Euros as well, if we like, because obviously there was a lot to talk about there in terms of England's extraordinary progress, some of the controversy around taking the knee, and where we ended up on that. But then, shortly afterwards, we had this proposed sort of abolition of domestic leagues and, not abolition, but for the best teams in the biggest countries to form a Super League. And it was felled by a kind of bottom-up revolt of fans, particularly in this country, actually. And I thought it was really interesting for one or two reasons. One is that if you talk to journalists who cover other European football nations, they said, people were a bit puzzled and not that pleased about it, and there were some protests. But the fans who were really upset about it were the British fans. And it's interesting that Britain seems to have a peculiarly strong attachment to its kind of local traditions and local cultures, which obviously is connected to certain other events that have happened in the last few years. Going back to your kind of emerging theme about authority here, you had the elites trying to impose something in terms of the world of sport on the masses, and the masses saying we're not having it, and the elites, by the way, handling it incredibly badly. If you ever needed reminding that elites can be stupid. These highly qualified, very highly accomplished, credentialed people just making a complete cock up of this. Then here's a reminder. So, and then I had a couple of other things on my list, but obviously we've got a lot to talk about. I just thought maybe we should mention the reopening, particularly from July onwards, where there was a real touch and go big decision about whether or not we should go through with close to full reopening, and the fact that we are, because it's easy to forget this, particularly now Omicron's happening, we're a lot further ahead than we thought we would be a year ago. We're in a much better place than we thought we would be a year ago. I just think that's worth kind of noting. I mean, I feared a lot worse a year and all sorts of things that could have happened have not happened. So although we are far from in a perfect world with regard to the pandemic, I think it's worth noting it could have been a lot worse. And then the third event, which might be just me on our panel, was the release of the Beatles mini-series Get Back, directed by Peter Jackson, which is a hugely kind of joyous cultural event for many of us.
Well, Ian, thank you for bringing a bit of culture in. That's great to hear. Now, I'm going to delve this football issue a bit with you. So first of all, I'll say something that I heard a few weeks ago, which rather kind of shattered the very kind of positive interpretation I'd had about resistance to European Super League, which was that, if you remember, the players didn't like the idea very much either. And apparently this is because they knew that the European Super League would mean a wage cap, and they weren't in favour of that at all. Now, I don't know whether that's true, just introducing a note of cynicism. But on football, and I'm going to get to the point here in a moment, but on football, I'm having a conversation with people recently about, the fact that the Premier League's test of whether or not an owner of a club is fit and proper is pretty thin, let's face it. I support West Bromwich Albion, who nobody really knows who owns them, and they were bought when we were in the Premier League. There's no serious attempt at a test of whether or not it's fit and proper. And then, of course, we've got the takeover of Newcastle United. Anyway, I was chatting to someone who knows a lot about football, and I said, why is it that there doesn't seem to be any real enthusiasm for kind of cleaning up the Premier League? They'll take money from wherever they want to. And he said, you have to understand that the EPL, as it's known globally, has now got the same brand recognition as the BBC. That 1 in 5 people globally, over 1 billion people globally, watch an English Premier League match, at least one match a season. It is, for a country which is seen to be in decline, defeated, run by a rather peculiar person, it is the only thing, really, about England which is being exported positively right now. So the idea that we're going to stand in the way of the Premier League taking money from whoever they can and seeking to dominate the world is preposterous. We will support them just like we would have supported British Aerospace in, potentially dodgy dealings in the past. So in the end, isn't the football story that, it's problematic in lots of ways, but, we have got the best league in the world and we'll do anything we can to keep it.
Yeah, but I also think it's interesting that the fan bases of these clubs are still so passionate and are so passionately attached to their local club, right? Because we often hear, understandably, the clubs have lost all attachment to their local area, and they've really become global brands, and they care more about their fans in India and wherever around the world, America. Now, that might be true of some of the management of those clubs, but actually when it comes down to the crunch, those fans, the ones who turn up to the stadiums every week when they're allowed to, are the ones who really do count, and they still have a very strong attachment to the Premier League and to English football, and the fact that attachment is even stronger here than it is in other countries, I think is really interesting. We are, you put it in a negative sense that we're quite a kind of inward-looking parochial country in some ways, but in a positive sense, I like the sense of not being prepared to kind of give up all our local traditions and local cultures to some kind of big global bland behemoth. So I found it actually quite an inspiring kind of revolt against the faceless bureaucrats. I'm starting to sound like a Brexiteer now. That's great.
Yeah. Even though virtually nobody who plays for any of these teams has got any local connections at all. But anyway, we might. And there's an interesting conversation here to be had about place and the irrationalities for place and the emotion of place. We maybe come back to that in a minute. But I want to bring in our third guest, Hardeep Matharu. Hardeep is the editor of the new independent investigative newspaper, The Byline Times. The paper focuses on highlighting stories the mainstream media can't or won't. And in a couple of years has amassed over 100,000 followers on Twitter. Prior to leading at Byline, Hardeep had a decade's experience across local, national, independent media and completed a law degree at Cambridge. So thank you for joining us, Hardeep. You've got a lot to choose from what Roz and Ian have said. They've covered a huge array of different issues. So what are you going to choose as the memorable elements of 2021?
Thank you, Matthew. So I wanted to highlight three sort of stories or moments that I thought held a mirror up to the country and actually, sort of got people thinking more broadly about some deeper questions. A lot of the work that I try to do at Byline Times, of course we do there, is about looking at some of the structural issues. So we don't follow a news cycle and just report on sort of more and more events that are happening. We try to look at some of the reasons why these things are happening. So the first development, which I think sort of held a mirror up and brought up some interesting questions, was Prince Harry and his wife, Meghan Markle. So this year, they were very vocal about why they stepped back from royal duties, why they moved to America. And quite memorably, they did this very high-profile interview in America with Oprah Winfrey. And I don't pick this moment because for its celebrity, or to discuss the ins and outs of what was being claimed about their experience and what happened. It's not about that, but merely to draw attention to the fact that we don't really talk about our monarchy, our royal family, and yet the Queen is head of state. Constitutionally, it's a very important role. We saw in previous years where Parliament was prorogued, sort of that interplay between the government and the monarchy and how that worked out. This has also been a difficult year for the royal family. I think Prince Philip passed away, and there are questions around how it can move into move with the times, I think. But I just think it's interesting that we never really look at sort of the things that underline the monarchy and the royal family. And it's meant to sort of, I guess, notionally be the symbolic family that we feel connected to and that we relate to in some way, as representing something of us. And I think Harry and Meghan's sort of story and experiences and claims really, really shed some light on some of these deeper issues, including, how diverse it is, including notions of what it's built on, empire. And also, I think Harry also mentioned this invisible contract, as he termed it, that exists between the monarchy or the royal family and the press. Both were invested to a large extent in creating narratives and stories about our country. So I just thought that was an interesting moment. And it's also interesting, I think, our sort of the country's reaction to Meghan in particular. I think that's really interesting. I think that raises more questions and holds up a mirror to ourselves, or it should, than about her necessarily. And the second moment, following on from that I thought was really interesting was, Ian alluded to it, is Euro 2020, this extraordinary moment where I think the whole country was really united. The England team reached the finals of this tournament. And again, I think it was a moment that really held up a mirror, because the other thing we don't really talk about in this country is Englishness, as opposed to Britishness, Englishness in particular. And I think this team, led by Gareth Southgate, a very diverse team, very committed to standing up against structural inequalities, including racism, taking the knee, but also the great camaraderie between them. It seemed to me that they represented a new generation, something younger and something more inclusive. And again, I think it was interesting what the questions that raised about the English identity. And of course, there was an extraordinary moment, I thought, when after the final, when the 3 penalties had been missed by the 3 players who were black, there was racism targeted towards them. And at that point, the Home Secretary and the Prime Minister called this out. And in particular, Priti Patel had said that was very wrong. And Tyrone Mings, who is one of the England players, said, well, you call this gesture politics. So you've got to look at the consequences of calling these stands gesture politics because of the consequences. That I think it was an incredible moment where I think the government's sort of so-called culture war and sort of amping up of very kind of divisive rhetoric at times around race and identity. I thought that was there was a lot of truth in that moment. There was some collision which illuminated something. And the final moment for me, which I thought was very interesting, came last month during COP26. So on a global stage, the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, felt the need to reiterate that Britain is not a remotely corrupt country. And the reason I thought I would say this as a moment that I thought was significant is because we don't, again, the other thing we don't really talk about is corruption. Now, corruption isn't, just with a capital C. There is a mode of corrupting behavior of the system which governs the way we live, in our case, democracy. And certainly the work of, those comments were made by Boris Johnson in the wake of, I think the Owen Paterson affair was still going on. And subsequently to that and since and before, we've seen numerous sort of government policies which arguably restrict civil liberties and rights. So whether that's protest laws, this notion of rescinding British citizenship, reports to undermine the rule of law and judicial review, and of course just the normalization of an environment in which lies or mistruths don't seem to matter anymore. And I think it was a really interesting moment because so Byline Times did a lot of work, and I would say it sort of led the way before the mainstream media got involved on exposing, for example, the cronyism around the award of government contracts during the coronavirus crisis, where the proper, the usual procedures were set aside because it was an emergency. And what we found out was billions of pounds have gone to associates and supporters of the Conservative Party. So all of these things, I think, and of course, what's emerged in the last week about the Christmas parties. So I think it's really interesting. We never really are searching questions of corruption within the British state or within our political processes. It's a process. It's not something that comes with one smoking gun and a capital C. It's a process. It's an idea. It's a way of being. And I think that we're always keen to point to other countries and say, well, they're corrupt. We're not like that. But the last point I'll make is I do think it's interesting that, for example, India today, under Narendra Modi, the response to the coronavirus crisis' second wave was absolutely devastating. I lost 2 out of my 3 uncles within 5 days of each other. And it's interesting why a country like India, after a significant period of British rule, has ended up in part so corrupt. Is that because Britain was there, or because we're not there any longer? So I just think all these 3 moments for me highlighted some really interesting, deeper, wider questions, which I think we could all do in this country with reflecting on a bit more.
Hardy, that's great. I'm going to ask you a question in a second, but I'm just preparing the rest of the panel. What we're going to do after I've just chatted to Hardy is I'm going to give you 3 quick fire questions for each of you to tell us what you think about whether it's been a good or a bad year in each of these areas. But before I do that, Hardy, if I want to follow up on that, it was fascinating what you said. I want to follow up on this question of corruption and accountability. So until the sleaze stuff really took off a few months ago, I had got to the stage where I just felt we'd abandoned any notion of accountability. It felt to me as though the whole country had just got to the stage of going, well, so what? We don't expect anything other than lies and low-level corruption, and we're bored with accountability. Now, that seems to have changed in the last. Suddenly, we care about accountability, we care about honesty, we care about hypocrisy again. How do you interpret that, Hardy?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely right, Matthew. I think, to my mind, it's quite extraordinary that after the coronavirus, we've had the coronavirus crisis, and arguably, or maybe it's not that arguable, the mismanagement around it. We have a very high death toll in this country. We have the consequence of Brexit still playing out. They have been playing out. I think we've all seen that in our day-to-day lives. And it's quite hard Brexit, but not necessarily the thing that was promised to us, the cronyism and all this. But none of these scandals or sort of issues have captured the public mood, as you say, insofar as accountability. As these recent ones about the Owen Paterson affair and, of course, the Christmas parties. I think to some extent, what underlines a lot of this is, again, the thing we don't really look at, which is our systems. We have an unwritten constitution, and largely, it's a system that relies on sort of good chaps being in power. We're reliant on norms and conventions. We don't have a codified constitution. And so it's what happens when people get into power in that system, who do have a very flexible relationship with the truth, who aren't willing to play by the rules as everyone else has, who have come before. And so I think this sort of notion of good chaps government, it shows the vulnerabilities of our democratic system. And I think some of the issues of accountability with some of these bigger issues, which are so huge, Brexit, COVID, really highlight that. But I think what's happened recently is we've had a few concrete examples of very clear moments in which the public at large has felt that this just isn't right. There is no accountability, and the people who are setting the rules are not sort of abiding by them, and they see the corrosiveness in their own lives. People had to abide by lockdown rules and couldn't see their families. They couldn't be with dying relatives. I think it's all become a bit more immediate. But the one last thing I will say, Matthew, is the role of the mainstream media in this. So the media is very powerful, and when it wants to hold the government to account, as we've seen in the last 2 weeks, it really, really can. But certainly at Byline Times, the other thing that we do examine is the media and its power, because it has a lot of power, and we need to be scrutinizing the media. We do need to be scrutinizing when it decides to run with a story and the broadcasters pick up on it, and when it doesn't, because that has an impact. In a democracy, journalism, truly independent journalism, which holds government to account, is a key part of democracy. It should be. And we, again, in this country, need to ask ourselves, where's that relationship between the press, the public, and the media sitting in between?
Yeah, great point, Hadi. That point about why does something become a story and something else not become a story? Okay, now listen, you three, you've been brilliant, but now this is where the pressure starts. We've got 9 minutes. And I'm going to ask you each 3 questions, and you've got 1 minute to give your answer and justify it. So none of you talked about climate change, which is pretty remarkable, actually. So we'll start with that. And I'm going to start with you, Ros. Climate change, are we in a better or a worse position than we were at the beginning of the year? What's your answer and what's your justification? Over to you, Ros.
Worse. I only didn't speak about climate change because I thought someone else would. I genuinely wrote that in my list. So I think worse because, okay, COP, we got a fudge. It could have been better, clearly, the deal that came away. But some progress is made, particularly on certain issues. But the big problem is it's sort of like, we've got we're putting a little bucket under the drip, and actually there's loads of water upstairs, and it's all going to crash down on us. I mean, we are ever getting closer to something that is fairly catastrophic, well, not fairly catastrophic, that is catastrophic, and we are sort of doing the tiny little things around the sides. One thing that struck me is lockdown. When you looked at the emissions that were reduced, it was so little, and we changed our lives completely. We stopped, transport was reduced, all those things. And that tells you how vast the change we need is, I think, although obviously certain things like actually working from home does actually use up quite a lot of power and so on. But the change we need is vast, and we are so far from it.
Ian, pessimistic from Ros on climate change, better or worse this year than we were this time last year?
Okay, well, just for the sake of contrast, I'll give you a more optimistic view. I actually thought that COP26 was as much about the discussions with business as it was between states. And the reason to be optimistic, if there is one, on climate change, is that you are seeing an enormous and fast change in terms of flows of capital into renewable energy and out of fossil fuels. You're actually seeing business, the investment community actually responding with quite a lot of speed and alacrity, as they tend to do once they start to sniff profits, and into new forms of energy. And I think that, as much as any government action, is going to drive change and innovation in the right direction in the next few years.
Well, Hardeep, you're in the Judge Shirley position now, which is Ros has been pessimistic, Ian's been optimistic. You're going to be the deciding vote on this.
Both good points. I think that, in my opinion, COP26 was disappointing. I think the fact that we had the presidency, Britain, there was so much we could have done, a lot of work we could have done behind the scenes leading up to it, which I think would have perhaps got some more concrete outcomes. I mean, again, for me, what I highlight in terms of our own government is the gap between the sort of rhetoric or the commitments and then government policy, in many ways, not just individual ministers and the way they voted, but sort of the government as a whole. We need to be looking at what policies it's still putting its strength behind when it comes to climate. We've also had interesting developments, I think, on a small scale in Britain about various sort of protest movements, Interstate Britain, and debates around that. I think it's interesting to evaluate to what extent they have been successful or are capturing the public mood or perhaps alienating it, and therefore what the way forward may be. But I would sort of go for negative, unfortunately.
Okay, so Ian, you, like me, you belong to the club of centrist dads. So the question for you is the Labour Party back a genuine and viable competitor in the next election, or in the end, are they still in the wilderness?
I think they are not fully back yet. I think Keir Starmer has a lot more work to do to prove that he is a dynamic and energetic and forward-looking leader. However, I do think they are in a strong enough position to make the Tories worried about what's going to happen at the next election, which, just hasn't been true for quite a long time. And I think the recent shadow cabinet change was badly handled for a few reasons, but I think the result was a real upgrade in terms of the talent on the front bench. Suddenly you see people like Wes Streeting and Yvette Cooper and Rachel Reeves in important jobs. She was there already, of course, but that team, it now starts to feel like this is now a government in waiting in a way that I hadn't really felt that before. So I think there's some way to go, but I think they're on the right path.
Okay, so Hardeep, Ian's given the Labour Party a kind of tentative thumbs up in terms of being back in play. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. I mean, it's been in a real pickle, to be honest, hasn't it? Because it hasn't really sort of at the start of the year and all throughout, it sort of, I feel like it hasn't wanted to mention Brexit, even as some of the effects of that have been playing out. So it's sort of in a bind with regards to its particular electoral coalition and how it sort of recaptures that. But I do think it's been more positive, especially in recent weeks. I think these sort of scandals of lobbying and corruption, or whatever lack of truth, has finally been capitalized on. I think that moment in last week's Prime Minister's questions, when Keir Starmer, he's really using the term, moral authority. Does this leader, Boris Johnson, have that? And I think there is a clearer contrast emerging between Keir Starmer and Johnson in the minds of the public. Whether that will go the way in favour of Starmer, it remains to be seen. But I think there's now a clearer distinction, and maybe that contrast is a good one for voters to have, because it is quite different, I would say.
So, Ros, that's two tentative votes for Labour. Are you going? When I say votes for Labour being viable again, do you agree?
I think one big problem that hasn't been mentioned here is Scotland, because don't forget, when they were delivering big majorities, they were winning an awful lot of seats in Scotland that they no longer have, and that they don't have an easy path back to winning. And that does actually, the SNP having such dominance there may shift at some point, of course, but at the moment, that's a real electoral block for Labour. I think Keir Starmer actually, I'm not, I'm actually slightly rare voicing this. I actually think he's doing a really good job. There's a lot of criticism, oh, he's too boring. I mean, next to Boris Johnson, don't people want boring? I mean, I think the challenge will be if Boris Johnson is not the Conservative leader at the next election. And, we're looking at a possibility that he might not be now. And for a long time, obviously, he was such an electoral force for the Conservative Party. But now, has that not been really chipped away at? And if you were offered Rishi Sunak or someone like that, it's perfectly possible, incidentally, that it won't be Rishi Sunak, but were it him versus Keir Starmer, that gap closes again on the sort of the moral question, I guess. I mean, the thing about Boris Johnson having another child, it made me laugh, because in all the papers bar the Telegraph, they have now started using the phrasing that I actually used a while ago, which was at least X children. Now, how on earth can we have a leader who can't even tell us how many children they have? I mean, I find it rather extraordinary. And I do think those things eventually, I mean, Boris Johnson's always had a form of exceptionalism when none of that sort of personal stuff mattered. In a Conservative Party, that should be of family values and Conservative values with a small c. But I think that exceptionalism is dying.
Right. So we now come on to the critical question, one that I'm amazed that none of you have mentioned, and you're all going to have literally 30 seconds to answer this. So in the final of Strictly, we have a gay couple, a profoundly deaf woman, and a black working class woman from the north of England. So the two questions are this. First of all, does Strictly demonstrate the culture wars are over and the progressives have won, or is it just a bit of Saturday night fluff? And secondly, who's going to win? So Hardeep, you're going first.
Oh, I haven't been following it, so no. I don't know who's going to win. I don't know, but is it sort of cutting through the culture war? I do think it's a really great to see the national broadcaster, the BBC, sort of having a lot more diversity in all ways in its primetime shows. I think that's really, really important, and I think it's more where the public are broadly. But I don't know who's going to win. No idea.
Well, you'll have to watch. Roz, culture war. Does it show the culture wars are over? A bit of fluff, and who's going to win?
So I'll do who's going to win first. Rose Ayling-Ellis, she's utterly charming, and I think the dance she did when the music stopped. Obviously, she's deaf. She's an EastEnders actress. I think when the music stopped and she covered the ears of her dancing partner and danced on me, I don't know, it was just really moving. And I don't watch the show normally, but I do catch up, media sort of have to vaguely know what's going on. Broader point about BBC, the BBC centenary next year, has not had an easy, obviously has a new boss, but he's had a very tough ride for the last year and a bit. And I think the BBC, is hugely aware and scared of a lot of these culture wars things, but that doesn't apply so much to the entertainment side. And I think the point that they should take from this, and the BBC should think about more broadly, is that it shows the country they like people with a good story. They want to enjoy a diverse, that's what they want to see on a Saturday night. And I think the BBC should probably take a look at that and think, actually, there's a lot to be really positive about here, and we shouldn't get too embroiled in culture wars.
So, Ian, it's appropriate to end with you, because I think your love of the BBC is second only to your love of the Beatles. So the significance of Strictly, and who do you think is going to win?
I agree with Roz. I think, and I hope that Rose will win, not least because she's my daughter's favourite. So I want my daughter to be happy. I think it's significant? Yeah, I think it is. I mean, I think it just represents and embodies the fact that this is a fundamentally liberal country with a small L. This is a country that accommodates and accepts difference remarkably well compared to countries. And so I think that warm, fuzzy feeling that we get when we see Strictly like this is not nothing. We should feel good about it. And just generally, I think both left and right, when it comes to the culture wars, should just chill out a bit. You know, we are a good country. Let's keep being self-critical, but let's also at the same time recognize that we've got a lot to be proud of when it comes to diversity and inclusion and acceptance. Yeah, I'm all for the Strictly message of Christmas cheer.
Well, how wonderful that we've ended on such a positive note. That's all we've got time for. It's been a fantastic session, a year of amazing RSA events. Do check out the RSA Events YouTube channel for any other of our events that you've missed throughout the year. Thanks for watching. Ros, Ian, Hardy, thank you for what's been a wonderfully wide-ranging and great fun conversation. Goodbye from all of us, and have a safe and happy holiday.